Welcome back to Haunted and Historic Australia for another episode in our ghost series. We all love a good haunted house story. Here's two that should chill you to your bones. Graham's Castle, also once known as Prospect House, laid claim to a number of ghosts in its heyday. There was talk of a headless man, sightings of a woman in white who tapped on the windows, and another woman in black who strongly resembled the occupant's living mother. There were also reports of eerie tappings on ceilings and floors and blood-curdling screams in the night. Some resident spectres even arrived in a horse-drawn carriage, which was heard coming up the gravel drive but never reaching the front door. The mansion was originally named Prospect House by John Richman, who arrived in Adelaide in 1838 with his wife, 4 children, 2 maids and 12 workmen, and their families. He purchased land on the corner of Prospect Road and Clifton Street of Prospect Village and erected the 30-room, 2-storey house. It seems Richmond was precisely what his name suggested, as he spared no expense. Rooms were spacious and opulent, with oak and cedar panelling and marble inlays. Some special features were a wide hall, a dining room with 8 doors that fitted into recesses in the walls, and a panelled partition that could be folded back to turn 2 large rooms into a huge one. A high stone wall surrounded the property, capped with broken glass to keep out unwelcome visitors. For those who were welcome, a wide drive ran through the grounds to a massive front door, adorned with 2 cast lion heads as knockers. All indigenous trees in the grounds were replaced with exotic ones, planted in a formal pattern. Richmond even installed a pipe organ, the first of its kind in South Australia. 8 years later, in 1846, the Prospect House was sold. The purchaser, John Benjamin Graham, had left England and sailed for Adelaide in 1839, and within 6 years had accumulated a fortune as a result of shrewd investments in a copper ore mine. He purchased Prospect House for £400 and set about acquiring 52 acres of surrounding land. Graham had become well known in financial circles, so businessmen and locals dubbed the property Graham's Castle, particularly as its crenulated parapet made it look like a castle. It was a name that stuck. Graham did not live in his castle long. He returned to Europe in the early 50s, and subsequently the house changed hands many times. It was during the tenancy of Nathanial Oldham that it acquired, rather after the fashion of stately mansions of the period, the reputation of being haunted. The earliest of the ghost stories at Graham's Castle are difficult to confirm, particularly the one of the headless ghost, which was supposedly seen a number of times on the stairs leading to the roof. Legend has it that a man had hanged himself on the roof, but without a date or name, one has to wonder if this was merely the chit-chat of servants trying to frighten each other. Far more reliable are the spooky claims of members of the Oldham family who leased Graham's Castle in the 1860s. Nathanial Oldham's son grew up in Graham's Castle and was quoted in a lengthy article titled Ghosts of Early Adelaide, published in the Adelaide newspaper, The Advertiser, more than 60 years after the event. Mr. G. F. Oldham, broker of King William Street, remembers well the ghostly reputation of the house when he was a boy, and his family was in residence there for some years prior to 1866. Mr. Oldham maintains that he recollects quite distinctly that one evening, about dusk, he entered the house and walked up the stairs. On the landing on the first floor, he saw his mother in a black dress. He called out to her and ran to her room, but she was not there. That was not so strange, as at the time she was out driving. Another night, his stepbrother, who was about 15 years his senior, saw his stepmother standing in his room. Nothing in the world would ever persuade me that it was not my mother I saw. Mr. Oldham affirms. The servants stoutly maintained at the time that the house was haunted, and none of them ever stayed very long. It was an extremely difficult matter even to get servants for the house, let alone keep them. 6 weeks later, the Adelaide Mail ran a feature story, Weird Hauntings of Early Adelaide, and included much of the Oldham's recollections of the Graham's Castle hauntings. The article ended with the following paragraph. Some time later, the family moved to Mitcham, and the house was left empty. Years passed, and rats and vermin became the only tenants of the place. Its ghostly reputation had become known far and wide, and few persons would venture near the place after dark. According to David Johnson, author of Lost Prospect, other unexplained phenomena were attributed to Graham's Castle during the 1880s. A story began that a woman had been murdered there. It was said that a woman in white tapped on a window while a card game was in progress, only to disappear and be followed minutes later by a tapping of shoes on the stairs. Numerous different strange sounds were heard, like a carriage scrunching up the gravel drive, but never reaching the front door. Eerie tappings on the ceiling and floors and shrieks during the night. The old mansion was unoccupied for lengthy periods. Its once manicured gardens gradually became overgrown and unattended. At one stage, students of Wynnum College boarded there. In September 1901, Graham's Castle was sold once more. Sadly, it was to be the end for the grand old house. It was demolished, and the land was subdivided. Do the occupants of houses built on the site ever hear tapping sounds on their ceiling, or awaken in fright to shrieks in the night? Have any noticed the strange crunch of carriage wheels on non-existent gravel drives, or felt someone watching through their windows? After all, where do resident ghosts go when the residence itself no longer exists? How creepy. It does pose an interesting question though. I wonder if the people who live there now ever see anything. It's kind of like Bungarraby in Sydney, the Bungarraby homestead grounds. The homestead's no longer there, but they reckon there still should be some ghosts hanging around. We thought we may have captured one, Major Hovenden, who went missing in the area and ended up dead, starving to death because he couldn't find his way out of the bushland that once encompassed the whole area. From one creepy house to another. Ascot House had seen many owners and occupiers since it began life as Toowoomba's largest and most elaborate grand residence in 1876. One occupant, however, remained there for over 130 years. The house was first constructed as a private residence for successful Toowoomba storekeeper Frederick Holberton. It was designed and built in an unusual U-shape, with verandas reaching beyond the length of the house. It was set on land extending on its western side close to the local racecourse. Holberton named his home Tor. Within its extensive grounds, it had stables, tennis courts, croquet greens, fish ponds and walking paths through imported trees and shrubbery. A large staff was required to help run the establishment, so Holberton engaged grooms, coachmen, gardeners, cooks and domestic maids. One of the maids, a local lass named Maggie Hume, who returns to our story later, began employment at Tor when she was a merely 12 years old. Geez, they started them young. Might have to get Erin in there. In 1899, Holberton moved on, selling Tor to the flamboyant and rich William Bate, who renamed it Ascot. 13 years later, it was on the market again, but when it failed to find a purchaser, Bate sold off the parklands and left the grand mansion standing on just 2 acres. Over the next 60 years, Ascot House passed through several hands, much like the first house. It is said that the US Army billeted troops over there during World War II. Later, in the 1940s, the then owner added 9 small flats to the existing house. But cheap accommodation attracted the wrong sorts of tenants, and maintenance was neglected. Windows were broken, vandalism was rife, and the gardens were left unattended. Then, in 1984, 2 visitors arrived at Ascot House. Miss Lois Jackman and a friend paid a visit on her friend's brother, who was renting one of the 9 scruffy, barely livable flats. There was rubbish everywhere, and when my friend, holding a candle, took me into the Gothic tower, we almost lost our footing on the rubble and broken plaster littering the stairs. Ascot was a mess. But that afternoon, seemingly against all reason, Lois made a firm decision she would become the owner of this house, no matter what obstacles might confront her. Within days, Miss Lois Jackman had signed the bill of sale for Ascot House. A few weeks later, she moved in. Fully aware that the sad house would require a major renovation, but determined to bring it back to its former glory. Almost every physical element of the mansion, from roofs and gutters to floors and plumbing, was on the edge of ruin. The flats with their population of drifters had been slums for generations. Lois Jackman discovered the unused upper story had several smashed windows, leaving it exposed to the weather, making it a favoured retreat for nesting birds. Lois later recalled that 103 garbage bags of pigeon droppings, nests and dead birds were removed from upstairs. Ascot House could have been used as a setting for a ghostly movie, but the skills of Hollywood were not needed for things to go bump in the night in this decrepit old mansion. Soon after the renovations got underway, Lois Jackman had several slightly unnerving experiences. Late one night, when she heard footsteps in the corridor passing her bedroom. Noiselessly making her way to the bedroom door, she flung it open, expecting to confront the intruder. The passage was empty. She nervously returned to her bed, but sat and listened intently, convinced someone or something was moving around her home in the small hours of the darkest night. There was another thing too. Nothing to really worry about, but on a couple of occasions, Miss Jackman noticed that chairs had been moved around overnight. They weren't shifted to another room, just repositioned. It always happened when no one else was in the house. One day, an elderly neighbour who had lived in Newmarket Street for more than 70 years called in to see how the renovations were shaping up. The neighbour reminisced about playing with the children from Ascot as a young girl. Then she mentioned that her young friends had told her of a ghost that they had occasionally seen there. She wondered if Lois might have seen it too. Lois Jackman truthfully replied that she hadn't, but the conversation planted a seed in Lois's mind. Maybe, just maybe, she thought something paranormal was going on in Ascot House. Shortly after my chat with that neighbour, I had a quite unsettling experience. It was about 2 a.m. and I was walking across a large empty room. When I was about halfway, I got a shock. Someone dragged their finger across my left shoulder. I swung around to confront whoever it was. No one was there. A few minutes later, I had to go back across that room. I was jumpy and quite scared, and reasonably so, as it turned out, because at about the same spot as before, the finger made its dragging movement again, this time across the right shoulder. I didn't bother turning around. I just got out of there. After the incident, Lois Jackman began asking her other long-term neighbours about their knowledge of ghosts at Ascot House. One person she checked with was the brother of a friend who had brought her to Ascot House on her first visit. He confessed that he had actually seen the ghost of a young woman slumped against a wall in one of the rooms. Others she spoke to recalled stories of a broken-hearted girl who was killed or died early last century. Someone else told of a servant who had committed suicide back in Ascot's halcyon days, soon after the Folly was built. But there were no names and no dates. There was nothing she could check or verify. While all this spooky stuff was very interesting to Miss Jackman, she still had renovations to complete and an income to earn. She had invested large amounts of energy and money toward bringing Ascot House back to its pristine glory, and had no time to indulge in macabre tales of restless spirits. In 1992, the restoration of Ascot House was complete. Lois Jackman took pride in her work, and in the October that year, the property was added to the Queensland Heritage Register. 2 years later, the premises was opened to the public as Ascot House Tea Rooms and Museum. With all her hard work behind her, Miss Jackman had time to consider the ghostly stories she had been told. Sometimes, while serving tea and scones in the tea rooms or showing guests through the museum, she told them about her neighbours' recollections of a ghostly presence in the house. Sometimes she even mentioned her own eerie experiences, adding that she would love to know who it was who walked the halls at night. Word of her quest spread far and wide. Then, in 2004, Lois Jackman received an unexpected telephone call. "I'm related to your ghost," the female caller said. "Your ghost was my grandmother's stepsister." A meeting between the pair was arranged, and Lois learned that her caller had stumbled upon an account of the Ascot House ghost while preparing her family tree. It transpired that 12-year-old Maggie Hume began work in 1880 as a maid at Tor, as it was known then. In 1891, aged just 23, she died on the premises. At first, Lois Jackman was uncertain she had found her ghost. She was aware that dying on the premises did not mean that the young girl was destined to walk the passageways of Tor for eternity, but further surprises were soon revealed. Lois Jackman read her informant's scrapbook of supporting information. She learned that Mr. Holberton was absent on the fateful morning, and that the staff, aware that Maggie had not arrived for breakfast, knocked loudly on her door. There was no response. The gardener placed a ladder against her exterior wall and saw Maggie lying absolutely still in bed, attired in her nightdress. They summoned the police. Her body was found on her small bed in the servants' quarters by Constable McKenna and the coachman Joseph Davis. As Miss Jackman browsed through the scrapbook, she found police records, newspaper articles, and even more telling, the autopsy report, which stated that Maggie's death had been caused by her taking 4 grains of strychnine poison. We've heard a lot about strychnine poison. Usually, it's to kill someone else, not yourself. But on this case, Maggie did herself in. According to police at the time, Maggie Hume had committed suicide after learning she was pregnant. 2 male staff members confessed that they had had what they called connection with her. The constable searched Maggie's room and found 3 letters addressed to Maggie's aunt, a resident of Toowoomba, bequeathing her certain small amounts of money and a bag of lemons behind the door. Official police record show that there was an urgency to get rid of her body. Maggie was found dead in her bed in the morning of 24th of July 1891. A post-mortem was conducted at the hospital morgue that same day, and she was buried on the following day in an unmarked grave. Having established the most likely identity of Ascot House's ghost, Miss Jackman took a further unusual step. Because she was a single woman who killed herself, she was buried in an unmarked grave. A caretaker at Drayton Cemetery had shown us where her plot was, so we'll know exactly where to put a plaque. It will be our way of showing her the sympathy she never received in life. Will this charitable action finally give Maggie Hume's restless soul the peace she so desperately seeks? Perhaps, but if not, at least Lois Jackman will no longer feel the need to sit up all night in terror, listening for approaching footsteps of a tormented spirit. Ooh, these haunted houses. Wow. So the tapping on her shoulder, or touching of her shoulder, may have been Maggie Hume. How interesting. It wouldn't surprise me in the slightest if Maggie was the ghost, as it all seems just a little bit funny to me. I don't know, maybe I'm wrong. Spending 11 years from the age of 12 with a family or a couple, because there was no kids as far as we know for Frederick Holberton and his wife Sophie, it seems that it would be very strange for a 12-year-old to be in their company as a maid for 11 years, and then at a time where she's now deceased, they just put her in an unmarked grave. This rich couple with no kids. It all seems a little bit odd, and the plot thickens even more because she had her sister working there too. Her sister was around 2 years younger than her and strangely dies a couple of days after Maggie's put in an unmarked grave. Catherine's now dead, her younger sister, and she's also put in an unmarked grave next to Maggie. How strange. 2 young women who possibly, Catherine as well, was working for them for a fair amount of time, thrown into an unmarked grave like they had no family. And they had an aunt. Apparently the note that Maggie left before she ended her life was to her aunt, yet her sister was working there too. Just seems a little funny. And how convenient for Mr. Holberton to not be there on the morning that she's found. Yeah, it just doesn't sit well with me. I don't know. Maybe maybe I'm reading too much into this, but for me personally, to be with a family that long, okay, yeah, she's a maid. But still, she was 12 when she started there. I mean, are these people so insensitive with all their bloody money that they don't give a stuff? It just seems really, I don't know. I think he was involved. I really think it was a cover-up. And for the sister to die of what? She was 21 and she just died? Oh, it was a broken heart. No. People don't die of a broken heart. No. I'm sorry. I don't buy that for an instant. I reckon they were hushed. They were shut up. Yeah. That's what I think. Anyway, but what do I know? What do I know, really? Haunted houses. Quite interesting indeed. So perhaps the hauntings aren't just from Maggie. Perhaps Catherine is involved as well. Yeah, interesting. But that was it. No mention of it ever again, except for, obviously, Lois Jackman putting light on everything again. These girls, their story just hushed. And I mean, if you can imagine someone who's quite wealthy in an area like Drayton that's now at this point of their death, quietening down as Toowoomba's raising up, you could probably pay people to make something go away, right? A couple of years after Holberton's introduced into the Legislative Council, who needs that kind of publicity? And whether or not he actually was responsible for her death or just made it quickly disappear, it's still pretty awful either way. Yeah. Oh, you know what? Or I might be wrong. One other thing that caught my eye was Frederick's wife Sophie, or Sophia, dies on his birthday, the 28th of October. So Frederick's wife Sophia goes on another 9 years, but dies on Frederick's birthday. How interesting. Very suspicious. But it sounds to me, and from some of the research I've done around the Drayton area, that there's other places around that area that are equally as spooky. There is some other talk that Toowoomba is one of the most haunted suburbs of Queensland. How intriguing. That definitely requires some further investigation. And one day we might venture to the Drayton Cemetery and check this out for ourselves. Until then, we hope you enjoyed this episode of our Ghost series. There's plenty more on its way, so don't forget to like, subscribe and share, and hit that notification bell. You know what to do. And why not put a comment down if you think you know what the spookiest town in Australia is. We'd love to know.
I was as beautiful as you once, not now. There was an old woman, all skin and bones. Oh, and she did weep and she did moan. Oh, she walked on through the streets of town. Where all the dead lay on the ground. Then turning to the parson said, will I look like that when I am dead? The parson to the old woman said,